better place, which is a ambition we should all cherish. But we need to get some hard questions out, responded to as we move towards that. And I hope you are going to pose those hard questions to to the panelists. I will request all of you to speak close to the mic because we have a large audience that is watching you online, and unless you speak into the mic, we will have poor audio in the streaming links. So bring the mic close to your face as you speak. So Palki, I'm going to hand it over to you. You will have 50 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samir, and namaskar and good morning to all of you. Hanke Brunschlot, gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to this panel. We are discussing a tapestry of truths. Can the two hemispheres agree? Let's start with you, Hanke. Would you say that Western values and Western systems, which were created for a different era, are not working anymore and not delivering the way they should have?
First of all, I would like to thank for the opportunity to be at the Raisina Dialogue. It's very important that we exchange thoughts because I firmly believe in an interconnected world. We need dialogue more than ever in this world in dire circumstances. And that's why I value this Raisina Dialogue, because it brings voices of the world together. And that's really important. We have to come to new ideas, to challenges collectively, and also highlighting not what sets us apart, what unites us. And then when I look at our multilateral system, yes, there has to be change, because the world has changed. If you look at the United Nations, at the Security Council, you see a reflection of the Second World War and the world order then. I think one of the panelists yesterday, the Minister of Ghana, said that very rightly. So we have to look at changing some part of our multilateral system. For example, the way the Security Council is now, the members of the Security Council who are now there. At the other hand, we still have the responsibility to work in the multilateral system and to use the United Nations to bring countries together and not let us divide. Because I'm always aware, and I'm a former military, that as long as you speak, you don't fight.
So, do you agree that the system is broken because it's not prevented wars or it's not promoted the rule of law and it's only sharpened camp politics? And should it be rebuilt or reformed?
I don't think it's broken. I think it has to be reformed. We have a multilateral basis, which is really important. But at the same time, it doesn't reflect the current world anymore. So we have to reform. And we have to make sure that all voices are brought together within the multilateral system and within the United Nations. So we have to work on that, but we don't have to throw it away.
Dr. Jaishankar, your thoughts on this? Would you say that let's reform the current system or let's build a new one altogether? And if we were to build a new one, whose ideas and values would shape this new system?
Well, I think the word broken may be too strong. I mean, it's like, the battery's discharge. I mean, it's running on very low energy. But it's also, I think, you need a different framework in a way. So you'll have to take the bits which work and I wouldn't completely reject what we have, but obviously there's a very strong case for a very radical change. And we need a radical change because, I mean, look, it's a common sense proposition. If you take the UN, when the UN was invented, it had at least about approximately 50 members. We have 4 times the members. So it's a common sense proposition that you can't continue the same way when you have 4 times the members. We use the UN very often to illustrate that point. We've also seen If you look at the last 5 years, all the big issues, in a way, we have not been able to find multilateral solutions. So the results are also, or the lack of results demonstrate the case for reform. But there's a larger, I think, global conversation and a global rebalancing as well, which is bigger than the UN, which is really, whose rules, how does it work? Because what has also happened is, in many cases, the rules have been gamed. We have today, we speak about globalization, for example, and the fact is that the world trading rules have been gamed. And we have a lot of our challenges today also emanate from how countries have used that for their benefit at the expense of the international system.
But in your conversations with various stakeholders, while everyone tends to agree that there is a need for reform, is there the appetite to do what needs to be done to push for that reform?
I think there's if you poll countries, I think the sentiment for change is very strong. The problem is, in many cases, the very people who are the problem are also the people whose concurrence you need to do that reform. So that's where the problem lies. So if you're going to ask 5 countries saying, would you mind changing the rules so that you have less power? Guess what the answer is going to be? The answer, if they were wise, the answer would be something else. If they are short-sighted, the answer is what it is today.
Anwar Gargash, where does the UAE and West Asia fit in the current global system? Financially, you resemble Western countries in terms of per capita GDP and etc. But based on history and shared experience, one would say you're closer to the global south. So let's hear it from you. Where do you see yourself?
Well, I think, first of all, let me say that we're already living the sort of aches and pains of an international system that is not in sync with our current system. If you look at just the vetoes that have been implemented on the Gaza file, the vetoes that have been implemented on the Ukraine crisis, you can see that there is a problem with consensus. And in my view, that we will not have another San Francisco meeting where everybody will sit around and reconstruct the international system. So we have to understand that in reality, the system is being eroded while our ability to introduce something new is really diminished. So we have to really think about how to deal with that. Vis-a-vis the UAE, I think we have a foot here and a foot there. We are, on the one hand, a country that has various interest and political investment in the rise of the global south. But at the same time, we also don't look like the global south in terms of our economy and in terms of our socio-economic environment. But definitely, we have an interest. Now, as a smaller state here, we are also concerned very much that we are, that the global system, countries that are our size, will fall within the cracks between what is the current system or the older system created after World War II, and about the sort of, diminishing, let's say, ability of that system to regulate security, to regulate the economy, and so on and so forth.
But all things considered, would you say that the UAE has benefited from the current system? Because you're robust financially, you have political heft. So would you ask for tweaks, or would you push for a complete overhaul?
Well, we have, I think, benefited, and we have also concerns. I think we have benefited, for example, from globalization, because we're a country that has benefited extremely well from open trade and open relations between various countries, and have played a role there. And we have also, have been taking initiatives in order to, it's not fruits that just fell into our lap, but we have taken initiatives from that part. But also, if you look at the sort of awful security situation, and we can clearly see it in the Middle East, I think we are also very concerned about the ability of the system to regulate itself, regulate its security, and you can very, very much clearly see it in what is happening in our region nowadays.
January Yusuf Makamba, would you say that the current system has an Africa blind spot? For instance, when the war in Ukraine broke out, the international/Western response was immediate, and rightly so, because it was a crisis. But when crises erupt in Africa, you don't see the same urgency, let alone the flow of money. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
No, absolutely. First of all, I have to thank the Minister and the organizers for having us here. Yes, absolutely correct. We believe that as countries of Africa, which I call the Southern Global South, we don't think that the current system works for us. We see a lot of hypocrisy in the way we deal with international issues that concerns us. We see double standards in application of international law. There is tremendous mistrust in the global economic and political architecture. We know that, and people talk about rule-based order, but the two key words here are rules and order. Who makes the rule? And we think that the current setup from the beginning has been not working for us. We think reform is not enough. I know that the current structure exists because it was somewhat a settlement of a certain upheaval. We think that there need to be a reorder, and the conversations about reforms, especially the United Nations and the way it votes, the way it makes decisions, are insufficient. Some of the ideas that are being thrown around, for instance, expansion of the Security Council, we don't think that would work. Of course, we don't advocate for another upheaval so that we have a reordering of the international order, but we believe that the certain incremental and plurilateral arrangements that we see now, India, of course, being part of, can help to build a new system of coalitions and partnerships that works for us. For instance, India has what they call coalitions or alliances: Big Cuts Alliance, Solar Alliance, Biofuel Alliance. Who would be against protection of big cuts? Okay, so if you choose specific issues and find outcomes that are fair and works for us, maybe that will be a building block of a new system that is fair and just, and that takes care of the concerns of the Southern Global South.
Do you want to respond, and do you think that India should then take the lead to rebuild this? And if you were to do it, who would you pick up the phone and call first, and what would you tell them?
No, I just wanted to make a comment that because the system today isn't delivering, it's not like life will come to a standstill. Countries, people will go out there and find their own solution. I'm giving India's case now. I looked at the last decade. We have actually initiated or joined 36 different alliances or groups or coalitions or whatever it is in very different fields, from Big Cat and solar to disaster resilient and Quad. What is happening today is there's a log jam up there. So because there's a log jam up there, everybody's doing their own thing, finding their own friends, making their own groups, depicting their own issues, and creating the new reality. So the new reality is actually going to be much less disciplined. It's going to be more fragmented in many ways, but it will still be effective, because if the guys up there aren't delivering, you got to do your own thing.
And yet some of those people, let me take this question to Jorge Quiroga. Some of these institutions are sitting on piles of money. You've been associated with the World Bank and IMF post-presidency. Makamba here spoke about mistrust and double standards. Did you see some of that in play while you were part of these institutions?
Thank you. I'll begin by expressing my thanks to the Minister and ORF for inviting us here. Great gathering, eclectic, from many different places in the world. I'd venture to say I'm probably here from the furthest, because if you drill a hole from here, you probably wind up somewhere in South America. And I live in La Paz, Bolivia, 4,000 meters over sea level, the only place where Messi, the great soccer player, has been 4 times and never scored a goal. So welcome, welcome over there. Yes, I'll make 3 quick points on trade, finance, and governance based on this. First, as a caveat, I know the Ukraine issue in Europe has reordered things for Europe in particular. And we in Latin America, or in Africa perhaps, get asked, why are you not on the side of Ukraine overtly and openly? Perhaps it's because through COVID, the first vaccines that we saw were from China and Russia, while the West was hogging their vaccines. And then post-COVID, when the money was flowing in Europe and the US, saving hotels, airlines, and what have you, we're still going through those pains, and we have not seen the amount of money and help that needed to happen. And the last point is, had this been couched in Ukraine in terms of preserving territorial integrity, that's something we would understand in Africa and in Latin America. When it's autocracy against democracy and NATO and what have you, or the West versus the rest, then you lose some goodwill in other parts. But the points I wanted to make on what you mentioned on the question. On trade, from a South American perspective, it's sad to say that the U.S. is closed for trade business. You cannot get a trade agreement through the U.S. Congress, and it's not Trump, it's the way the U.S. Congress works now. Europe, about the same thing. In South America, we have had the longest dating trade negotiation in the history of humanity, 25 years of European South America trade negotiations, and it hasn't come to fruition yet. So China is open for business. They are signing trade agreements. They are buying the minerals, the energy, the food from South America, so it creates natural links. On finance, you mentioned some of these organizations. Yes, they need to be capitalized. We got the SDRs from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, but we need to capitalize the regional banks. We need to work on debt reduction. It'll be interesting to see what happens when China, which used to be a developing country that used to owe money, has now moved to the creditor side, and it needs to take haircuts on the debt for Africa and Latin American countries. It will be a different type of game. And the final point on governance. Yes, it is inconceivable that the governance mechanisms of the World Bank, the IMF, and the UN still work with rules that were imposed in 1944, 1945. That was even before the 2 US presidential candidates were born, I think. That was a long time ago. And those are still operational. Could it be conceivable that by the 100th anniversary of these organizations, India is not in the Security Council, or Brazil is not on the Security Council? Not to me. Can the World Bank still be run by an American, the IMF by a European? It will not work. And they will wither on the vine if we do not do the reforms. Can we do them next year? No. But I suggest that before they turn 100, we have to reform these institutions. Otherwise, you will see institutions like the BRICS coming on board, and people will, the R making maybe a little too much. Instead of a brick, if you made it a lighter, and a BICS without the R in Russia, perhaps it would be more effective, but I'm not running those. But those things will continue to happen, and the world will the developing world will look for funding. The last point that I'd like to make on this is the huge opportunity that India has. India showed deft diplomacy of the highest caliber on the G20 management. I hope my friends in Brazil can take a page from you, Minister. That this cycle of Indonesia, India, Brazil, South Africa is a great opportunity to put all these issues on the table and to do trade reform, to do finance reform, debt reduction, to do governance reform. and take on some of these issues. And India not only has that very goodwill minister, but also I would subject to you probably the strongest diaspora in the world. And I would like to be from a country that in the US has the Indian ancestry people with running the World Bank, running Google, running Microsoft, number 2 job in the US administration, and number 2 in the Republican Party. India has a lot to be proud of.
Absolutely, and taking from what you've said, this is for Dr. Jaishankar, countries will find solutions and partners who are willing to work with them. So we could say that it's not just a post-truth world, it's also a multi-truth world where we all have our own truths. For India, the truth is that we have a historical relationship with Russia that the West needs to accept. For US, you could say the truth is that they will give this relentless support to Israel no matter what. How do you then find a middle ground, and how do you impress upon your Western partners that they must accept India's truths?
Well, look, it will be everybody's endeavor to find middle ground. The reality in many cases is we won't find middle ground. We will find some ground, some common ground. But the idea that everybody would agree on the most important issues of the day is a bit of a fantasy. The fact is, competition is for real. You spoke about camp politics. Sometimes there's a logic to it. President Quiroga spoke about, how institutions are, antiquated and sticking with the old rules. I agree, but I think in addition to the old issues, there are also the new issues. I mean, if today there is, let us say, take the big debates of the day, connectivity, debt, trade. Now, how these are leveraged today? These are not necessarily all coming out of the West. So, the West, as the dominant force earlier, is largely responsible for what, where we are today. But I think the new players haven't helped. I mean, again, if you take UN Security Council reform, the biggest opposer is not a Western country. So let's get the totality of the problem right. So I think the reality is we'll have to battle bit by bit to create groups which will push for change. I would say, on many issues, you will get different combinations of countries. And we'll have to live with a long period of incremental progress before we get to some kind of landing point, because, as Anwar Gargash said, you're not going to get a second San Francisco conference.
Right. Hanke Bruinslot, how do these conversations typically go for you, given the complicated history and the fact that your country was also a colonial power? So when you engage with global South countries, how do you try to convince them that Western values or European values are important, given the fact that those same values have hurt them in the past?
I'm not in favor of speaking of Western values. We have universal values, rule of law. I think if the debate is about our Western values, I think it's better not to impose Western values upon other countries, but to speak about mutual interests and values you share. And therefore, it's important that we have bridge builders in the world. And I want to compliment our host on the leadership you have at the global stage, because last year you invited at the G20 the African Union. That was a really important step, because we are a small country, the Netherlands, with a relative large economy. And if you look at our history, but also at our present, we are always dependent on doing trade and having international relations. So we are very much aware that we have to live in an interconnected world, and that we have really have an eye for the mutual interests of other countries. But we need also countries who can build bridges in this world. And in my view, India, through its global leadership, is a country who can build a bridge between other countries. With having more leadership on a global stage, it brings also responsibility. So let us unite on mutual interest and seek the values which we share. And one of those values is, of course, the rule of law, but the interest of giving welfare, trying to build upon welfare on all our societies. So it's about mutual engagement and connecting each other instead of imposing something of one to another, in my view.
Dr. Jaishankar, is that a responsibility India is keen to take? Do you want to be the bridging power?
No, I think we are a bridging power to a great degree. We showed that at the G20. I would say whether it is COVID or today, some of the regional conflicts, people would see us as relatively objective, unbiased, I agree with my Dutch colleague that, at least to the extent we can get common ground, we should strive for common ground. It will never be perfect. There will be many issues where we won't be able to get common ground, but that should not deter us from seeking it where we can. I think here a lot of what India is trying to do, there are different names, but the idea of a kind of multi-vector policy, what in our own language we call like Vishwamitra, which is like a friend of the world, you maximize your relationships. I think that's the direction we are trying to take ourselves and take the world.
January Yusuf Makamba, we're talking about values, and is there an expectation that then Western values are universal values? Is that what you've experienced? And there's often also a tendency to look at Africa as a monolith, as against 50 or more than 50 different independent, proud countries with possibly some common challenges, but also some unique challenges. So do you think that this approach that we have right now does not take into account the cultural differences and the histories of various African nations?
Yes, and obviously that's a challenge, and Africa is a very diverse continent. As we, of course, pursue unity as a continent, so it's okay for us to be viewed as an entity that wants to be stronger and powerful and have a voice as a continent. But I think that the broad brush about the condition and the engagement sometimes is not helpful. And we see it in these partnerships, and actually in the last summit a week ago in Addis, that was part of the conversation, how Africa engages with the rest of the world. Is it okay for 55, 54 African heads of states to be summoned in one capital by one leader to be read about the plan of that country and take pictures and leave? Depends on what is the nature of the partnership with that particular country and the work and the history that has gone into putting that initiative together. So there's a bit of resentment now and a bit of rethinking about Africa's partnership with the rest of the world. Now, countries that want to engage in Africa are different in their relations to the continent. Some of them have historic solidarity with the continent since decolonization time, for instance in India, and an affinity is easier to find. And some engages us in an honest, transparent, and equal and respectful approach. That's what we're looking for. I think that a just, equitable future has to start with acknowledgement of the structural asymmetry and historic injustices that has led to a condition that Africa finds itself. I think there has to be an honest conversation in terms of how we get out of here. As I stated earlier, I think that we have to reimagine a setup that allows for resolution of some of the challenges that exist. If we just scratch the surface, we will continue to experience distrust and resentment from African countries as it relates to international relations.
That's a very, very strong point that you make. Anwar Gargash, West Asia's foreign policy seems very generous. You have good relations with the West, you have good ties with India, China, Russia, Africa, and the UAE is a prime example of that. What is the end goal here? Is this purely transactional, or is there more to it?
I want to just weigh in a little bit about the issue of values that has been mentioned there. I think while there are principles of universality, I think we should respect diversity. I think diversity in India is a good example of diversity, and I think we should actually celebrate diversity rather than put everybody in a straitjacket that there is a certain way, certain values that represent all of us. We have to accept that there's a line between what is universal values and what actually is different and celebrated by different religions, different ethnicities and regions. I think also, on the other hand, my worry is really, is the international system able, I think we are moving away from traditional geopolitics, which when the United Nations was formed was really at the core of what was going on. And geoeconomics are an important part, important space where we're all working in. But we're moving to an area of geotechnology. And with geotechnology, my worry still is that basically changes in the ground, changes in the environment of the international system are not going to be encapsulated by ability to reform the international system. So again, how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to deal with the various changes that we will see, which will only widen the divide, because some countries are going to be very adept at bringing in a new technology into their societies, into their economies. Other countries will fail miserably at it. So how are we actually going to bridge that divide? Vis-a-vis our relations in West Asia, as you mentioned, I don't see it as transactional. I mean, for example, our relations with India today, which is going through really a golden age, is not transactional. It's an age-old historical relationship, but modernized by the future, with a clear foresight, really, by Prime Minister Modi and by Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, and you can see it in all aspects. So clearly, some relations will remain transactional, but any country actually wants important relations to be multifaceted, wants these relationships to be mutually beneficial, because that's the only way for these relationships to move forward. So I would like to think that our relationships are not short-term, and they are definitely not transactional, and we are always looking for the sort of strategic narrative in this relationship.
Since you mentioned values again, let me take this to Hanke Bruinslot. There's also confusion on what these Western/universal values are anymore, because in your own country you have a prime ministerial frontrunner who's saying some very disruptive things about not taking in Ukrainian refugees and not giving aid to Ukraine. Or, for instance, in the US you have a Donald Trump who's talking about unilaterally abandoning multilateral commitments. Does this frayed national consensus in some of the Western powers impact international institutions as well? And then why should Global South countries trust the West?
Putting me on the spot. It's also about humanity. If we look at the people in our country, we want the best for them. And the only way we can do that in these times is to work together. Let me use a really small example. I'm convinced that the European Union and the Indo-Pacific are interconnected. If there's not security in the Indo-Pacific, or not, there's an economy is decreasing, it will affect the European Union. So we have to work together. And if you are partners in working together, you have to build upon trust. Trust is the most important part of working together, because you won't work together if you don't trust each other. If you look at the current situation in the Netherlands, it's true, we have a caretaker government, but at the same time, there's still a big majority in our parliament who supports Ukraine, but also a big majority in our parliament who is in favor, for example, for a two-state solution in the Middle East, so a viable Palestinian state and a secure Israel. But trust is the basic of every partnership, of every mutual engagement. So if you aren't willing to build upon your trust, you're losing the world, and you're losing your position in the world. And as a Dutch minister, I only know one thing for sure: our future is interconnected with the rest of the world, because 1/3 of our of what we earn in a year is, make it very simple now, it's not all about money, but 1/3 of what we earn in the Netherlands, we earn that because we are trading with other countries. So to conclude, we have to be trustworthy, because trust is the basis of every cooperation, and in the end we have to look at the importance of building upon strong society and human welfare, and that is in its all interests.
Right, and I understand it's also a challenging time for Europe given the economic situation and the war, and you have to find the financial resources and the political appetite to reinforce these points. But let me take the next one to Jorge Quiroga. I think we all seem to agree that we need to reshape this as a more multilateral multilateral world, but is multilateralism then a viable plan for an international system, given that continental multilateralism has not delivered in a lot of places? Like we have SAARC here in Asia, which is lying dormant, or you have the Organization of American States, which rarely makes news. The remotely successful model, you could say, is the EU, but there are also too many disputes and a lot of squabbling. So if continental multilateralism has not delivered, how do we assume that on an international scale it will?
I would say a world that adapts to the reality of the emerging powers in our fellow global south nations. And I'll give you one practical example. I mentioned that US and Europe do not seem to be open to trade. Because of our Spanish, Portuguese ancestry in Latin America, we have affinity with Europe. Because of geographic contiguity, we have affinity with the US. So that's where our hearts would normally be. But our pockets are with China when it comes to energy, food, and minerals. The rise of India brings an opportunity to line up our pockets and our hearts. A democracy that is a large market that we can do business with. The word of caution here would be lithium. I challenge you to go back to your rooms and count how many lithium batteries you have in your briefcase or backpack. I have 9 between the watch, the phones, the iPod, the Kindle, the iPad, the rechargers, and what have you. I don't have a car yet or a motorcycle yet, but that world is coming. China is dominating that. Lithium batteries need cobalt, nickel, manganese on one side, graphite on the other, and the lithium are like the tennis balls that go back and forth. China is refining between 63 to 95% of each of those components in a lithium battery. And if you make it iron phosphate or you change it to sodium, I'm afraid they're still going to be strong. That is a dependency coming from a country, Bolivia, that has 25% of the world's lithium reserves. Argentina, Chile, our neighbors have 35%. That is very important, but the dependency on China could be somewhat dangerous. India has the market, has the wherewithal, has the strength to be able to diversify. So my word of caution would be on this new world order, we have to beware of that we were too US, Europe linked, and we could be too China dependent, particularly when it comes to lithium. So the rise of India is good news. Get the EVs going in India, and then our hearts and our pockets can be lined up with a giant like India.
Anwar Gargash, I have to ask you this. The UAE has joined BRICS, which many see as an anti-Western bloc. Is this a vote against Western-led institutions, or are you just keeping your options open?
I think it's more a vote of bridge building. I think, and creating more and more options and relations. I think like many other countries, and in view of the main theme of our talk today about really changing world, I think more countries understand that the more networked you are, the more bridges you have, the more relationships you have, the more options you have to grow your technology, grow your economy, grow your diplomacy. I don't really see this as taking one side against another side. We want to maintain our traditional relationship, and we want to add to these relationships with new friends, new links, and consolidate these through real heft, through economic relations, through strategic relations, and through technological relations. So I don't really see it from that perspective.
Dr. Jaishankar, there's been so much talk about values and shared values, but the fact is that in the current political landscape, values are increasingly looking less important, and countries pick and choose when to apply them. Case in point, again, the war in West Asia. Do you think it's time then to admit and accept that these relationships are based on interest, and while countries can compromise on values, they never compromise on interests?
Well, that's not something new. That was always the case. I mean, look at our own example. Very literally in our first year of independence, we put our trust on multilateralism and took the Kashmir aggression issue to the UN, and others made it into an accession issue. And they did it for geopolitical reasons. So the fact is, if you say, are people playing multilateralism? They always did. We've grown up. And so today look up, it's not like we should be against multilateralism. Multilateralism is a kind of lowest common denominator and anything above that. It will exist side by side with national interests, with the calculations and competitions of countries. But I also agree with Minister Janbari when he said there's a place for sentiment, for solidarity. I mean, the biggest thing which is happening in this country right now is the water, the Jal Jeevan mission. If you want to see international Jal Jeevan mission, you should go to Tanzania and see. I mean, we went and, we're doing fantastic water supply work in Tanzania. So I think there is it's at different levels. We shouldn't make it exclusive. But to the hearts and the pocket observation, I would say to add to that also the mind, that life is about hearts, life is about pockets, but life is also about thinking your way through, thinking for yourself, finding solutions. And when you spoke, can India be the bridge? I think India can also help the world by offering solutions from our own example, which, and the digital would be the most appropriate case.
Right. I have a lot of questions, but I think we're out of time. I think the takeaway for me here is that we need to reinforce a multilateral rules-based order, but I guess we need to revisit the conversation on who's making those rules and are those rules applicable to the current time. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you, Palki. Can I request you all to come to the top of the stage for a